Good morning and welcome to the second day of the first public budget week of the TCU, promoted together by the Secretariat of Governmental Macro Evaluation and the General External Control Secretariat. The first TCU budget week has the goal of fostering dialogue between specialists with the end of fostering knowledge relative to budgeting and planning instruments in the environment of the federal public administration. To ensure the program, we would like to have all the participants keep their microphones muted while they're not speaking. And all the speakers should keep their cameras open as well. This will be transmitted on YouTube by the official TCU channel. These will be questions can be asked on the chat, and these will be selected and will be sent to the debate. Today's program will start with panel 2, which will debate public budget as a transparency instrument. The members of this panel are Felipe Salto, Orlando Cavalcante, budget consultant for the Federal Senate, Carmela Zigoni, political consultant for the Institute of Socioeconomic Studies in NESC, Welles Abreu, visiting researcher and postdoc at the FGV, Fernando Facuri Scarfi, a professor of financial law in the law school at USP, Dr. Sérgio Ricardo Caribé, a prosecutor of the prosecutor's office together with the TCU. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to thank our guests, Orlando Cavalcante, Matias, and our professor Fernando Scarfi. It's a great honor to receive you all in this panel, above all to discuss such an important theme for the Brazilian population. All the public policies, all the initiatives necessarily go through a budget process, and discussing budget as a part of transparency is essential so that society can understand the priorities that are being chosen by the federal government, and they can also monitor the execution of this budget to change reality and improve our society and the quality of life of our population. I'd like to wish you all a calm time to speak. I hope that within your time you can expose your central ideas and allow everyone who's watching to know more about public budget and how to interact with the responsible institutions. I'd like to give a special greeting for everyone who's watching us on YouTube, as well as those who will watch the event later. I'd like to greet all of the technical staff in this event. They're supporting us so that we can carry out this work, and I hope that we have a moment of reflection, of debate, of very high quality, which certainly because of the curricula and the expertise of our guests is certain to happen. So good morning, good work to everyone, and I declare this panel to be open. And to start, I'd like to open the floor to our first guest, Mr. Felipe Salto, who is the president of the Independent Budget Institution. Thank you, Felipe. Good morning, everyone. First and foremost, thank you, Ricardo Bernas, for this invitation to participate in the first budget week of the TCU. I'd like to greet all of my colleagues in the panel, Sérgio Caribé, the prosecutor, Orlando Cavalcante, who is a longtime partner at the Federal Senate, Welles Matias, and Carmela Zigoni, as well as the great professor Fernando Scarfi. So I have a presentation divided into 3 topics that I would like to share with you, and we have this proposal of the budget as an instrument of transparency. Well, actually, we go on the wrong way as far as transparency goes. If you check what has happened in the budget process over the last few years, the Citizen Constitution is on its 33rd birthday today, and I don't think there's any better time to discuss transparency in the budget process. Of course, over the last few decades, we had important advances in the area of public accounts, and not only the rules, the fiscal rules, but also in the process of the budget itself. Ever since the 80s, when we changed the movement account that existed in the central bank and in the Bank of Brazil, and we had the Secretariat of the National Treasury, so that you could have an autonomous and efficient management of public accounts. Then we had the fiscal responsibility law, the renegotiation of the fiscal areas with the states, the closing of many different banks. So there was a process of evolution as far as public accounts, but we're still very far from ideal. The public budget process today consists in a style of inertial process. So the next budget ends up being the same as the expenses of the previous year, plus the inflation or value above inflation. A large amount of the primary expenses, so non-financial expenses, are a given. They're rigid, they're compulsory, or they have some kind of connection or some kind of indexation. So only 7% of the budget ends up being effectively discussed, and within this 7%, we include investments, which are on their lowest level in the historic series. In 1973, the level of investments in the public sector as a whole, including state companies, regional governments, and the federal government, were 11% of the GDP. Today, we are investing less than 1.5% of the GDP. So within these discretionary expenditures, we include investments, which have been cut in order to follow fiscal rules. We also have the expenditures of the public machine costs, and a part to pay for health and education in order to fulfill the constitutional minimum investment in these areas. So this leads to something that Professor Alan Sheik from the University of Maryland, maybe the largest budget specialist in the world, he said the following when he came to Brazil. He said Brazil needs to have a budget process, in fact, because in Brazil we have two budgets, EPA, which is the PPA, which is the pluriannual plan, and the budget law. He was really astounded when he saw how much resources and effort went into the PPA, and actually it wasn't properly connected to the yearly budget law. Therefore, the budget has been walking towards two institutes which are fundamental. We have spending reviews, which are periodical reviews of public spending, and the second one, we have the medium expenditure framework, which would be something like a medium-term fiscal planning. These two ideas would allow Brazil to have a budgetary process which would allow for more planning, a budget that's turned towards results, according to Howard Cheek, because on a medium term, this would be conceived based on autonomous ideas on the revenue. Today, for instance, on the proposal for 2022, the budget already was born out of date because it had an inflation of 6% for the end of 2021, when all of the market actually foresees more than 8.5% of inflation for 2021. What needs to be clear, however, is that this process of revenue projection should be done with more accuracy and with the participation of academia, the executive legislative powers, of technical experts, but also in a distinct manner than the way it is done today, because there's very little clarity on the models that are used, on the calculation of elasticity, of revenues, of GDP. They're all implicit in the projections that are the base of the fixation of expenditures, because there's something very clear. We estimate these revenues and then we apply this to the expenditures, because revenues are estimated based on the evolution of activities. Therefore, you must have a macroeconomic model for GDP projections that should be the base for 2 or 3 scenarios in order to base the fixation of the expenditures, and so that you know within the probability of these 2 or 3 scenarios for the next 10 years. On a scenario like this, technically designed scenario, we could discuss the guidelines for the budget, priorities from society, how we are going to actually put into the budget the changes in demographics, in the economy, in the society structure. For instance, the rapid aging of population, according to the IBGE tables for population, will demand an expressive amount increase in health expenditures. In older, more developed countries, the health expenditures tend to increase based on the percentage of elderly people. So, if we end up not thinking about this, we're always going to be putting out fires on the budget process. And so, if we're talking about the accrued, if we're talking about these court order debts, this was always thought of as a primary compulsory expenditure. In terms of fiscal risks, this ends up being annexed to the budget guidelines law. And so all of these documents that I mentioned, you don't know what is the foreseen estimated value for the next year. The aggregate informations are there, and the government also had this detailed information, at least in terms of risk, in terms of projected value. So what concerns us is that on the imminence of having to pay 89.1 billion in court-ordered debt for next year, the previous projection of the LDO, the Budget Guidelines Law, was 56 billion. We already have an amendment saying that we should pay this in pay it in installments. So the first part of my presentation says that we must have a much higher transparency in this process and in more adequate planning, because if we're very close to going past the spending limit, and especially next year, what the government has been saying is to propose paying in installments. So they're taking away from the spending limit this volume of compulsory expenditures, or they could say that they could limit these payments to a maximum value. This is a typical case of a discussion that has nothing to do with budget planning or discussing the future of the country, public policies which are essential. While we don't change this, we are going to continue creating a plethora of fiscal rules with very little efficiency. I would like to say that Brazil never, if you look at it, Brazil always follows the fiscal rules. Usually the primary goal is just a restriction that is modified. And we had this so-called creative accountability from 2008 to 2014, whereas the spending limit, which is supposed to be a limit to the spending, then you end up taking away things from the spending limit, and you get these proposals of changes in order to make it easier to actually fulfill the spending limit. So the rediscussion of priorities, The hard part, the reevaluation of public policies, which are the spending reviews, that's the stuff that we haven't been able to advance in. And that's not just now. What happens is that today, due to the very evident fiscal restriction, these problems are more explicit. These problems are more visible to everyone. On a third part, and I'm already going to be finishing to be within my 10 minutes, I'd like to talk a little bit about the macro fiscal environment. We have been in a deficit ever since 2014. We will probably have a deficit for the next few years. The public debt divided by the GDP, that is, it was strongly benefited over the next few months, but over the past few months, because of the increase of the inflation. The high inflation is an old friend that helps public accounts if there's a certain cynical attitude involved, which is what is happening. So we have a 10% inflation, and inflation measured in the environment of the GDP, which is called the implicit factor, the level of the prices that are imbued inside the GDP, is above the IPCA and NPC measures. This makes it that so that the nominal GDP goes up, and the nominal GDP takes down this relation, this division between GDP and public debt. And they took away all the stimulus that was used for COVID-19. So these two factors together explain this so-called improvement in the fiscal environment of the country. But this is just an illusion. Starting in November, December, or at most in January, we're going to see once again a higher relation between public debt and GDP. So we must guarantee the conditions for sustainability in our budget. So the sources of financing for the state, we have tax collection or public debt with the payment of interest rates. The Selic rate, which controls the interest rate, is going up. The expenditures in interest rates in August was 36% above the same month last year, already reflecting this increase in interest rates, not only the Selic rate, but also priced interest from the market. This imbues a vision that risk is going up. This has to do with external factors, but above all, with national domestic issues. The court-ordered debt, the tributary reform, which is going towards a negative liquid result to the country's, to the government's income. So all of this is perceived by the market agents as a moment of risk, and risk is priced with an increase in the interest rate, and the interest rate going up makes it so that the public debt situation is less sustainable. So we have the challenge of restructuring public accounts, having a fiscal and budgetary reform, which is extremely necessary because we have a golden law, we have the primary goals, we have the spending limit, all the things inside the fiscal responsibility law. So we have this plethora of rules which is not really harmonized. So you must have a harmonization and a actual commitment to all these objectives. So are we going to need more revenue? Are we going to need to lower expenditures? These questions aren't answered. And having a very little transparency in the budget process, this means that this is done in an almost automatic manner. The managers of fiscal policy end up being just rule followers. They evaluate whether this device, whether this law has been followed. And of course, the rules are very important, but the spirit of fiscal responsibility still isn't shared, especially in our elite, in our administrative elite. and in society as a whole, which is very concerning. The solution for this goes through a fiscal and budgetary reform, adopting modern reviews like the spending review and medium term fiscal plans. We must have a reorganization of fiscal rules and also more transparency. Transparency doesn't just mean publishing data. We're actually pretty good at publishing data. Orlando will probably talk about this. They have a fantastic system, which is Cine Brasil, which allows it to replicate 90% of what exists in the old CIAF. So, today we have information on the budget. That's not the hard part. The hard part is transparency in budget management and fiscal policy administration. So I'll finish up my speech. Thanking you all for the invitation. Greeting all my colleagues. It's an honor to be here. And I'd like to thank the Federal Court of Accounts for allowing me to have this space and for this opportunity. I think the path of dialogue is fundamental so that we can build a different future than the ones that we projected in the past. Thank you very much.
Excellent, Felipe. Congratulations for your first remarks. First, because you represent a new institution in our legal ordering that was created in 2016 to provide more transparency in the public budget. Your vision brings perspective of relevant and current problems of the country and highlights the importance of following up the social dynamics. Two important elements that are relevant to the population. The aging of the population is one of them, and situations that incidentally happen, as the situation of the court order debt. In some moment, this account would arrive for us to pay. So it's important to bring all those elements. It's very useful for the population, for the technicians who work in this area, the ones who work in around this topic, so that we can be more acquainted with these subjects, and we can deepen our knowledge on this, knowing all the aspects that talk with the budgetary situation and things that affect the everyday life of the population, that generate effects over the increase of the inflation and other problems that have to be looked at in a broad perspective, with all the nuances and aspects that are involved in the budget issues, in the implementation and execution. Now, to continue this conversation, I'm going to hand the floor to Orlando Cavalcanti to bring this vision of the production of the budget document, not only the annual appropriation bill, but also the law, the budget guideline law, and it's important to have someone from the consulting area, the budget consulting area of the Senate of Brazil. So before handing the floor to our next guest, I'd like to invite everyone who is participating in the virtual audience so that you can answer the survey that we send to you. And with no further ado, let's hand the floor to our next panelist. He's a legislative consultant from the budget area of the Senate. So, Orlando Cavalcanti Neto, the floor is yours. Good morning, ladies, gentlemen, all the participants of this roundtable, dear Carmela, and Felipe, Professor Vélez, and Fernando Scaff. It's a pleasure for me to be discussing this topic with you. It's such an important topic. And the question is, why transparency? And how can the budget, the public budget, be an instrument for this transparency? I'd like to recall the popular knowledge and say, and saying that the popular saying that the cattle only gets a little fatter under the eyes of the owner. So the budget is political control, a social control. So this is the first thing I should highlight to you. I split my lecture, my presentation in 3 parts. First, the 30 years of the budget, the public budget. In the second moment, I will talk about the revision of budget as an instrument of transparency. And the third part, what we're going to face in the future. In the past 30 years, the transparency evolved very much, but we still have lots of challenges. We know about the difficulties that we have, and specifically talking about the federal budget. And we have the state and the municipal budget as an instrument of public and social control and a political control. And at the end of the day, it has the answers for the questions regarding the budget. And, of course, in the ballots, people will respond to the public managers if they are satisfied or not with the management of the budget. Felipe mentioned about the difficulties that we have in the implementation of the budget, the public budget, the information. He shared important information with us, but my focus will be regarding transparency. I'd like to start talking about the evolution of transparency in the past 30 years. I'm going to focus in the federal level, but at some point I will also mention the state and municipal levels. With the re-democratization of the country, with the charter, the constitutional charter, with no budget information whatsoever, we had about 500 offices in the Congress, but not a lot of information regarding budget. The information that we had in the Congress resulted in the investigation committee in the Congress in 1993 because there was no transparency at all. And with this Congress investigation resulted the budget. So in 2004, the Senate launched the first product, the first transparency project to the public, which was hard to understand, for the normal public to understand. It was the first generation of such document for transparency in Brazil. In this moment, when the budget arrived, people had information of when the budget arrived in the Congress up to the point that there was the bank transfers regarding the budget. So we still have daily difficulties. But we were able to enable the citizens to have a tool for data crossing. It's not only about showing the data. You have to enable the researcher to cross the data, pluriannual data, and other perspectives. In this aspect, there is a second element which was prepared by the termination of the fiscal responsibility law, and the states and municipalities also had to expose, to show their information online. There was a lot of difficulty for that, but several municipalities and states were able to find a good level of transparency, of information availability. Also, we have other platforms of the executive branch that happened, one called CIOP, the platform Mais Brasil, in which we have a great amount of data that is available for the citizens. I'd like to talk to you about the second part, and then I will go back to the challenges, because although we have this multiplicity of data, as Felipe mentioned, we still have problems. We still have challenges. But now I will talk about the vision of the public budget as an instrument of transparency. First of all, I think we need to stop thinking that to look at a budget as a bureaucrat, an administrative bureaucrat, only numbers, only figures. It's more than that. It is the possibility of executing the public policies. Without budget, there is no public policies. The real need is that it's necessary to have social control for the citizens to see the execution of public policies. And they can do that, but as I told you, who are the owners of this? The citizens. We are the owners of that. And the press and the organized civil society and institutions such as NGOs, for example, in NESC, that Carmela represents. So we will only have, this is my personal point of view, that we will only have a good budget policy and good execution of the budget if the society is monitoring that. Without this monitoring, I don't think that the budget will be better executed. Maybe creating different methods, but if we don't have this participation, this monitoring from the society, and it is part of our young democracy, 30 and something years old democracy, and it's part of the maturing of the institutions. But to me, this is important, the maturing of the institutions and social monitoring. So how can the budget be monitored? First, you have available to you all the step-by-step of the movement of the budget. For most people, it's hard to find this information, but institutions in Brazil already work on this. And what we need is for these institutions to be heard more frequently. Another point is that the public policy must be explicit, must be clear, transparent. It's hard for people to follow up the public policy of the federal budget. And it's hard because we have the problems of classification, and some systems have problems of updating in others. I will refer to them later. And besides this perspective of the policy as something that is public and the budget being an instrument of transparency, we have other options which are more complex, and it would provide to us information, more accurate information. Another option is to monitor the parliamentary amendments. They are there, they are online, and you can access them. I'd like to say that I think I have, what, 5 minutes? Well, I wish I could speak more, but I will go back to some points in my second moment. But in the past, the parliamentary amendments had no transparency, and after the Congress investigation, In the times of the Fernando Henrique government, there was the release of resources which was not transparent for the amendment, everything with the authorization of the government, and then we started the process of impositive amendments and the rapporteur amendments. My question is, what is the role of the Congress to carry out these amendments? First of all, we need to understand that the public budget, was an instrument to finish the authoritarianism of the king, per se. When you have parliamentary amendments, it's well, in England, I'm talking about the origin of that in England. The budget was done by the king, and that's it. So the amendments were a great achievement in the social point of view, because the budget stopped being implemented by the king, and it changed the situation. So it's okay to have amendments in the budget, but the problem is how they are made and how they are monitored. So we really need to stop with the authoritarianism of the king. But the Congress has this movement of amendments have to be monitored, and this monitoring must be one that provides responses in the ballots, in the voting processes of the population. Well, I don't have a lot of time, so I will only mention some difficulties that we have in the public budget. The challenges. The first one that I see is that the language should be simpler. It's not that we will weaken the perspectives of the public budget, but the language should be simpler in a way to communicate with the public, the normal citizens, with the necessary amount of information, so you can have the budget as to provide a possibility for analyzing the budget. Since 1994, the Senate has worked on the transparency of the budget, and one of these initiatives is the Siga Brasil. We have the citizen painel Cidadão. It is an attempt of translating the technical language to simple language to the people, to the citizens. It's far from what we wanted it to be, but it's already quite advanced. We have the specialist panel, which allows the specialists to cross the informations, and we have the amendment panel. We saw that it is not enough to include the information and to provide information online is not enough. You need to offer education. So the Senate now has a project called Orçamento Fácil, or Easy Public Budget, and on YouTube, it's on YouTube, and it has over 1 million views. So the idea is to take it to the schools, to take this information about the budget to the schools. It's a work of the prosecutor's office, the federal prosecutor's office, and the protective council. And, it's a work that takes time. I don't have much time anymore, but I just would like to mention the technology. I think technology is also something important for us to have transparency in the public budget. There's a very interesting article that was launched. In the second phase is the e-government, e-governo. E-government consists of information, of processes, and it's closer to what we're doing. And the third step is the digital government, is when you use the social media, AI, and big data to obtain information and to enable to have a technology that will provide more information concerning the budget and to see the difficulties that people have. So it is a way to interact with society. We are far from that, but it is certainly a goal that we have. It is. We also have to think of the perspective of the pluriannual budget, and also the government uses words to talk about public policies that are not repercuting in the budget. So we have lots of challenges to tackle, and my time is up. Unfortunately, I will go back. I will hand the floor back to our moderator. Thank you for the moment to speak. Thank you very much, Orlando. Your talk is extremely important for us to understand the need of the social monitoring of the budget. Before handing the floor to the next guest, I'd like to talk about this aspect. To enable the information to the population in a way that they can understand. If the language is not accessible to the population, it will be distant for them, or it will help very little in terms of transparency. So I think this initiative of the Senate is very important, especially the orçamento fácil, the easy public budget, to enable the population to monitor the budget. And the simpler the language is, and the better the society can absorb the information, more equipped the society will be to monitor the budget. So it is really essential for the society, especially for the society, to have answers of what are the needs of the society, and the Senate, the Congress, will be able to understand these needs very much better. So we can see that some situations it's very important to understand these needs, especially now, as we can see in the pandemic. So it's important to know that this information not only to combat the pandemic, but for other levels of the economic scenario. And now to talk about the organization, the participation of the society, the organized civil society, I will invite Carmela Zigoni. She is a political assistant in the Institute of Socioeconomic Studies. It is an institution of the organized civil society, which allows this communication between the society and the public power. So, Carmela, the floor is yours. Thank you very much. Good morning to all you, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to greet the participants of our roundtable in the person of Minister Sérgio Caribe. I'd like to salute the colleagues that spoke before me. And today it is the anniversary of the Constitutional Charter, and we are also in the figure of 598,000 people who died from COVID-19. It's important to remember that as well, to pay tribute to all these lost lives. Danielle will help us with this, the presentation of the material. So I speak in this place of this organized civil society, monitoring the public budget and helping to contribute with the transparency processes. This slide is a little what is our institution, INESC. We are an organization of the civil society. We are not partisan. We have a public commitment with the monitoring of the budget and with human rights. We work with certain topics, and I invite you all to visit our website. But we monitor the social environmental agenda, also the indigenous and women agenda, and the quilombola peoples, access to medication, and other topics. We participate in several networks, as the International Budget Partnership, uh, IBP, the Global Forum for Fiscal Transparency, the GIFT, the Latin American Network of Fiscal Justice, the OGP, Open Government Partnership. We have participated on it since the beginning. We worked in the first phase of this organization in Brazil, and the Forum for Access of Public Information. We also interact with the government by through a platform of social movements for the public reform. So the judiciary level, the legislative and executive branches are part of our interests, and we help with the communication with different parts of society. We also work in the agenda of gender and racial equity, and we participate in the Global Forum on Discrimination. Our action is guided by a methodology called Budget and Rights. This methodology has 5 principles. State financed by fiscal justice, so we have a regressed system that penalizes the poor people and waivers the rich ones from paying taxes, so we need to correct this structure. The second principle is the maximum use of available resources for carrying out, for materializing the rights, citizen rights. So we are concerned of public policies that are really used for the good of the majority of the population. We see today a very unequal society. Number 3, the realization of the progressive carrying out of rights. So the access to school, for example, is a right that we demand for the quality education for children, and the rights must be progressively being exercised. Number 4 is the non-discrimination. So it's our struggle against the discrimination and the violence against indigenous people and women. And 5, social participation. It is a very dear principle to us. And I have a quote for us as for our reflection, which is also our principle. The fiscal rules must be adequate to the guaranteeing of rights, and not the rights being reduced to adhere the fiscal rules. From this general guideline, we have several types of actions oriented by this methodology. I have some examples of studies that we carry out. For example, subsidies for fossil fuels in Brazil, knowing, assessing, and reforming it. Also, the analysis of the 10-year federal resources destined to pharmaceutical assistance that was carried out in 2019. And the budgetary credibility in Brazil from 2019. I'd like to highlight that our main source of data is Siga Brazil. In this portal, we have very well granulated and disaggregated, transparent data. So I'd like to salute Orlando for his work. And also, we use the transparency portal, and we also use the law to access of information. So we request public hearings with the public powers. For example, the impact of the COVID-19 on Black and Quilombola populations, and the budget for teenagers, children, and youngsters. There are some articles in the press, and one of them I monitor closely, which is the budget for women. So the low recurrent execution of budget, and we don't have today mechanisms that bring awareness to the managers to really use the budget that is in the law, in the appropriation bill. And also there are other reports that were publicized about these matters. I'm going to show you a little video of a campaign that it's another front of our work. It's called "I Only Believe It If I See It." Let's see. There's no sound. Danielle, please.
Não tá, tá sem áudio.
Yeah, there's no audio.
Eu queria sugerir então para a gente passar para o próximo.
In that case, we're going to go to the next slide, and at the end, we can try to play this video again. This campaign is a campaign of transparency for the fiscal incentives. Also, we work on training to stimulate the participation of society. So they need to be trained. They need to have some technical qualification to understand the budget. So we have this training with youngsters and social movements, civil servants, to translate the budgetary information to other types of public and to incentive this social control of the public budget. Also, we have reports. We produce reports. One of them was called Brazil with Low Immunity. The main findings is due to the spending limit, Brazil was not prepared to face the pandemic. So that's why we call it low immunity, because the country was not financially prepared to face this pandemic. In 2019, the expenses with health was the same as 2014, but the population was increased in 7 million people. This year, we launched the second version of this report. It's called Um País Sufocado, a Suffocated Country. There was an opening of credit, and in any case, the country stopped spending or avoided spending 81 billion reais to combat the pandemic, and also the most vulnerable population suffered because of that. We had the 6-month balance, and around 320,000 people died in by COVID-19 in the first semester in the second semester of 2020. Also, we talk about opening the data for social control. We have the legal framework in the Constitution, and also we have the law of access of information. It reflects the principles of open data that were agreed internationally. We have normative instruction and other frameworks. And we have in the Constitution that we do not participate only by voting. We have plebiscites, referendum, and I would like to salute the TCU hearing for providing some support, and also the councils and the conferences. And these social control options are being dismantled. In 2014, there was distinction of the national policy of participation. In 2019, there was the distinction of councils, committees, and over 15 councils were closed, including a very important council, which was the Nutritional and Nutritional Security Council, and it was extincted also last year. There were attempts to reduce the transparency between 2019 and 2020, and also in 2021. I highlighted some of them. I will not read them now, but the presentation will be available to you. But there were measures to restrain the access to information. The health ministry cut the data on the website, and then when it came back, there was a wrong information, wrong data in the website. There was a presentation of 8% of negative responses in the law of access to information. Also, we had evasive responses from our requests, and we need to insist to get information from the authorities. So we needed to count on the Supreme Court to be able to receive information. Go back one slide, please. Also, besides the Supreme Court, we have other mechanisms. Last year, we denounced our institution, INESC, and other organizations. We denounced to the Organization of American States because of the lack of transparency. So we sent a document to the Rapporteur Joel Hernandez Garcia, and we've been trying hard to fight against the lack of information. So what do we propose? The guarantee of the fulfillment of the law of access to information. There are some civil servants that they have the right to do that. To guarantee mechanisms for social participation. So we want to guarantee the existence of the councils and not the extinction of them. And the more accessible versions of the auditing report. So we wish that TCU could have a citizen version of the report. It would be very interesting for us to share this information. It is a quite long report, and we analyze it, but for the general populations, it's hard to access. And also we propose the suspension of the spending limit, because it is, as we heard here, it's a contradictory measure in comparison to other fiscal measures. So open data, we think that it is a policy to be done with the budget, not only with hackathons and other managers that are committed, but actually a public policy that is well structured in the field of technology. I'd like to thank you. This is my contact, my email address. So for the ones who are watching us, if you have questions, you can just contact us. The video is, I want to try to play that video to you again. It's quite a short video.
I don't think we will be able to do it yet. The technician is trying to make it work in order to transmit the video with the audio. Thank you so much, Carlos Zagoni, for your exposition. Yes, participation of society is very important, and institutions which only try to translate to society informations that are produced with a lot of technical rigor, and we need this technical rigor, but at the end of the day we end up compromising our ability to communicate with society. So I think there's a very opportune suggestion in the sense of and this is for all federal organizations, not only the TCU, and so that we could have a more understandable communication with society, a simpler manner, so that you don't give this whole universe of information that people oftentimes don't understand. I think these contributions are very welcome, and it seems to me that these ideas are great, especially this idea of communicating in a simpler language. So we need to identify lots of situations that restrict transparency so that we can go towards more transparency. We'll have to think about this in the activities that the Institute has already been promoting. So I'd like to remind you all who are watching us online. Here on the chat we have access to the link of the research, and the more collaboration we have, the more we can actually share this with the other speakers. Now it's a great pleasure to receive someone here in this event, someone who around 2 to 3 months ago was a monitor in the master's degree in which I was studying. It was great to have your knowledge on that occasion. And now we'll have the opportunity to know a little more of your opinions, which come from academia. So we had the opportunity to listen to Felipe Sal, who came in with the point of view of the Independent Monitoring Institute. Then we had the Federal Senate, and now Ineski from Carmela. And the next two speakers are speakers from academia. So I was rereading an article that you wrote with Professor Ricardo Gomes, and I have no question that your contributions will be great. And so without further ado, I'd like to open the floor to Wesley Matias. Thank you so much, Caribe, for your care, for your, I hold you in very high esteem. I'd like to greet all of my other colleagues and to congratulate you all for your speeches. It's easy to go after these beautiful presentations. On the one hand, it's very easy because it makes me comfortable, but then in the terms of reaching up to their knowledge, it makes it harder. So I hope that I'm able to share something of my knowledge with you as well. So now let me share my screen. Is it working? Can everyone see my shared screen? So, before anything else, I would like to say that all the opinions that I'm setting forth here, these are personal opinions based on scientific evidence, on my studies. These are not necessarily the opinions that are shared by the organizations which I work for, which I am linked to. And I'd like to send a big hug to all of you who are watching, but especially to my colleagues from FGV, my students from SGV, my students from IBMEC, as well as my colleagues from the Secretariat of the Federal Budget. Where I've been since 1998. So, public budget as an instrument of transparency. I hope to be able to speak very briefly. We have certain topics here which would certainly demand other events, other seminars to deal with, because there are a lot of topics. So first, I'd like to talk about how the literature on public administration has been evolving, and obviously the theme of budgets is inside this context. So when we started on the bureaucratic issue, so that was the theme of reforms for a lot of the 20th century. And then we went into this managing point of view from 1980 to 2000. Then after that, we went into governance, and now there are authors who are claiming that we should have a process of opening the government. Obviously, practices contribute to theory and vice versa, and that's a natural evolution. So here, this idea of the open government, here we have this focus in accountability, an open government, transparency for data sciences. We have data sciences that are revolutionizing. We have AI. We have new decision-making processes. The incrementalist vision is a vision that's been validated by Vidalski in the 60s. And it's not only a Brazilian vision. This is an international thing. We need to break this idea, and we must try and understand why we've been doing this ever since the 1940s. So this process of transparency and opening will help us have more clarity and efficiency. So we also should focus on communicative actions to build consensus and civil society engagement. This is the vision that's been growing in public administration. So how can we say that Brazil can fit in this historical series? I'm going to start a little bit before. In the case of Brazil, I think it's important for us to have a little more clarity, and I'm very happy that a lot of people have already mentioned a few of the points that I've put here. So the first mark that I'd like to talk about is 1808. We had a very absolutist point of view, and then another important point in history that impacts on the budget. In 1889, we have the proclamation of the Brazilian Republic, which was a critical view to this asset-based, patrimony-based view of Brazil. The budget ends up being a legislative initiative. The first Republican Constitution is an initiative of the legislature, and it prioritizes democratic issues, but soon it becomes an initiative of the president in the second Constitution of the Republic. And then we see a period in which we don't actually solve this issue of the patrimony-based system. So we have what we call colonialism and clientelism. In 1938, we create the DASP, which is a symbol of the bureaucratic reform in Brazil. And what we wanted to do is go further than the proclamation of Republic to get out of this clientelist point of view. In 1994, we have a need to increase and improve our budget with a flexibilization, simplification, and modernization. This was very influenced by this managerial point of view. We have the directing plan. We're seeking to implement this managerial model. We have infralegal advances that seek to do this with the involvement of stakeholders in the process of developing policies. Unfortunately, we start having the dissemination of the so-called parochial amendments, the legislative amendments. And so we have a very high risk of corruption. And we have a variety of different corruption scandals. Like, there's so many different scandals. I put in the leech scandal, as it's known, from 2006. And we had the tractor scandal very recently that has to do with this. So we sought an implementation of an instrument inside the LDO the budget law, budget guidelines law, that says that the execution of the budget, the LDO, is published every year. So this is for over 15 years that I'm sure we already have this being published every year. So the execution of the budget law from 2020, you could not use to influence in the appreciation of legislative propositions in the National Congress. So here we have an observation from SIGA Brazil and other systems such as CIOP. There's an increase in the total amount of these legislative amendments. From 2019 to 2020, it grew by 3 times. It's a very expressive increase. And this was kept in a certain way in 2021. The great question we have is, if this legal instrument is making sense, are the institutions working in order to deal with this risk of corruption? That's something we must be very aware of. Researchers, public servants that act in various processes in various parts of the government, in the legislative, executive, and judiciary, as well as the public prosecutor's office, as well as civil society. What are the most recent events in Brazil that happened? Well, we had an improvement of this issue of public governance, which was also influenced by this theoretical framework of public governance. These are instruments, transparency instruments, which are strengthened during this period. And we have the presence of mechanisms, leadership, strategic control that involves planners, not only from the government, but also from civil society. And of course, there is evidence in this sense that it has become more transparent. We have plans, so the processes are altered so that we have participatory mechanisms in all the different powers, especially in the legislative power, with systems like e-democracy, but they also happen within the executive power, the creation of different instruments like in the PPA and in the LOA with the participation of society. And we also have products here which seek to bring this to this effect based on starting in the 2000s. Here we have participated legislation, fiscal education. Fiscal education is something that I participated in its birth. It makes me emotional. We have a very intelligent girl that's called Sofia, and she teaches budget to her colleagues and to her parents. So there's a partnership with schools, municipal schools, in order to do the capacity building of children, making budget clearer to society. We have a variety of capacity building initiatives for society. We have seminars, including this seminar. This is a great example of it. We have the institution of the citizen budget, even though this would be a more simplified language. Here we have the transparency portal, open data. Not only the transparency portal, but also CIOP, SIGA Brazil, and other websites like INESC, open accounts for other institutions, because this is not something that's just unidirectional from the executive power to society. All the stakeholders that are involved have this responsibility of promoting transparency, involving the issue of public councils, public hearings, social audits, public hearings. We have participative budget. We have a central to receive crime accusations, collaborative projects, and eGov, digital government. So participatory budget, it was a technique that was created in Brazil and that was recognized internationally, and we are doing this, promoting transparency all over the world with this tool that was originated here. So how is Brazil in this index of open budget index? How do we look as far as transparency? So the IBP, which is a budget institute, international budget partnership, when they do this measurement, the open budget index has to do specifically with transparency, even though the questionnaire has other indicators that also involve things that have to do with social participation. We are doing very well in relation to this OBI. We're in 5th together with Georgia out of more than 100 countries. We have a grade 81 out of 100. We're considered as having an extensive availability of information. And it's important to say that this didn't just come out of nowhere. There's an intense work for a variety of institutions like the executive power, the legislative power, contributing to the fostering of this transparency. We went from 71 to 81. That doesn't mean that we're satisfied, both in academia and with actors that are directly involved in this process. We still have 19 points to grow, and sometimes, well, I believe that soon we'll also be reaching these values even more. And we need to have new tools and to improve this process continually. So this improvement wasn't in a situation of that just happened spontaneously. There was a huge effort by various stakeholders. This involved the executive, legislative, judiciary power, the prosecutor's office, the civil society participating in this process. And this influences, they demanded all the involved parts so that this happens, so that this improves continuously. So you can see that in 2012 we had the creation of citizen budget. In 2015 we had the improvement of the bi-monthly reports. We're still very far from ideal on both of these instruments. They really must be improved. Changes maybe to a pluriannual view. This needs to evolve quite a bit so that we are able to improve these processes, not only the government but civil society, academia. And we have the improvement of the consultation reports like CIOP, and there's others, the transparency report, SIGA Brazil, all of these portals. So there's a huge effort from the executive government, civil society, UNESCO. So this makes the data from the budget a lot more clear. I've been saying ever since the beginning of the slide that we still have space to improve, and so we need to improve. We have things to do. So that's extremely positive that everyone is demanding this, and we're also influencing other actors to improve. So we have extra items outside of the OBI. They review a low level of civil engagement, 17 points out of 100. This has to do with what was said already. This process of civil engagement is something that we really need to improve quite a bit in Brazil, and it's interesting that it's directly related to the issue of democracy. Translation apologizes, we're having connection problems. Civil engagement is just something that's imbued in democracy. So we are a reference in budget transparency. In 2011, we were one of the founding members of the Open Government Partnership, and we signed the Open Government Declaration. We have GIFT, and we've also been a part of it ever since its founding. We're a founding member, and we collaborated with the high-level principles for transparency, participation, and accountability. And we had a critical view both of society, from academia, and all different parts of the government. And everyone looked at this issue that we need to improve our transparency, even as leaders. We have a UN resolution which was proposed by Brazil in 2012 and was adopted by the UN, which stimulates the member countries and its institutions to the promotion of transparency, participation, and accountability all over the world. So what we have here is a statement that we are a world level reference in this case. That doesn't mean that we can't improve and can't be critical of ourselves, and we need to keep on improving. So based on my postdoc research, my current research, having said that we have a good level of transparency, why haven't we gotten some results? And I'm talking especially about this issue of perception of corruption. Why is it that Brazil still has a high perception of corruption? So we went after the scientific evidence, and what we can see here in the data that we collected inside different sources that involve data from the OBI, the IBP, the International Transparency. So the larger perception of corruption, the lower the corruption is, just to make it clear. So the size of the observations represent the level of the democracy from the economists, because here we think that democracy matters not only for transparency but for corruption. So we had this gap that needed to be faced. So we saw something. The lower the opening and the lower of the perception of corruption, the more progress, the less progress it has, and the more opening, the more progress we have. So what's curious here is that we saw that there's a certain barrier in which certain countries were institutionally stuck beneath this barrier in a vicious cycle, and some that went up behind the barrier, they were in a virtuous cycle. And here in the animation you can see that smaller countries, they hit the barrier, then they come back. They tend to come back. Very few countries go past this barrier, and the same also happens the other way around. So just so we have an idea of a specific situation, like in Brazil, I'm going to have, this is Brazil here in the animation. We're basically stagnant here. We have a lot of transparency, and we go up and then go down, but we have a good level of transparency. But unfortunately, we cannot go above and go towards those people who have a better perception of corruption index. That is, the higher perception of corruption, the less corruption. So these countries have a smaller cycle area than the ones above. What does it have to do? This is the democracy level. There's another factor here that's very relevant. The level of democracy in the country. It's not just transparency. Transparency is fundamental, but we must have an appropriate level of democracy. So another interesting case is the case of Georgia. Look at Georgia. Georgia is able to go above the line, and then here, around 2010 or so, it comes towards progress. And it's actually in a better position than Brazil itself as far as corruption perception. Look at how interesting this recent speech from the president of Georgia. Translation apologizes, but we are having connection problems. So the president of Georgia states that the agreement between the European Union and its country puts an end to a crisis that could have put into ruins the democratic advance that was achieved over the past few decades and weakened the country's progress in its long path towards integrating the European Union. Through dialogue, leadership, and commitment, Georgia's political leaders put aside their differences for the welfare of the country. So I like to highlight the democratic advances which were achieved and promoted together with this issue of transparency. And how does this... let's look at a comparative case. Let's look at Brazil and a country that has a very high level of corruption perception. So Brazil and Norway, the transparency index in both countries are very high. They're the same. However, the democracy indicator for Norway is a lot higher. This has an impact in the corruption perception index. This was commented in the last slide. But let's expand this situation on the 5 parts of the democracy index. We see that Brazil is good on electoral process. We don't need to mess around with the electoral process. Civil liberties, we're still in a good situation as well. However, we have 3 other components that we really need to work on with reforms to improve this model. So we have governments functioning. So what does this mean? We should have more efficient decisions with more accountability, so we'll have an improvement in leadership. And what I say here is not just the executive power. We always have this point of view. I think this involves all the different powers, but and NGOs as well. NGOs, we need more NGOs, more participation. Accountability is a word that isn't exactly translatable in Portuguese because of our culture. And we have very little time of democracy in order to have evolved this, but we need to persist in these areas. Another aspect is the issue of political participation. This was already explained a little bit in the survey for the open budget survey. Says that we must increase civil engagement, ethical, free civil engagement to have more legitimacy. And then we have the political culture. We must have a respect towards democratic stability and the rule of law so that we can increase trust. I think these are the 3 points that are really determinant for us. So going towards the end now, I'd like to put in a slide with my conclusion of my presentation. Transparency is fundamental, but democracy matters. Democracy is very relevant. It's very significant. Democracy is fundamental for this process. So, other than being transparent, it's fundamental that we promote free elections, the system of checks and balances, an absence of military interference on economic domains, political and religious freedom, and the existence of associations and political parties. In this way, we expect that we can have enforcement in budget results so that its institutions really follow the rules with results that promote the rule of law, civil engagement, and accountability. Well, that's it. I hope that you enjoyed my presentation. Here's my contact. Those of you who want to contact me or talk to me, just I'm available, and you can just use your cell phone on this QR code. This will lead to my LinkedIn, and then we can have establish a dialogue between ourselves. Thank you very much, everyone. I think that here I can do the presentation of the video. Can we try?
Mas a pulga atrás da orelha pode ser nossa amiga. Ela nos avisa. Preste atenção. O alerta pode surgir junto com uma notícia na TV.
Translation apologizes, but
Gastos tributários. Uma forma
we
de
have
reduzir
more than one
o
audio at once.
Oi?
Pronto. Coloque no início.
Continua sem áudio?
Não, está com áudio. Você
Opa.
pode colocar no início, por favor, que eu vou pedir para a equipe técnica
Alô?
tentar colocar ele em tela inteira.
Okay, we can start the video over again. Can you hear me?
O áudio está o
Opa.
vídeo
The audio works. Now we just need to.
com áudio. Aí eu lhe peço para colocar novamente.
So you can put in the video and then everyone,
Para quem nos acompanha pelo YouTube.
I mean, you can put it on your full screen.
Peço que a equipe
Can I put it on then? Yes, I'm going to ask the team to try and do this on the full screen. Okay, let me try again.
Vamos lá.
Ela causa uma coceirinha chata.
It
mas a pulga
causes
atrás da orelha pode ser nossa amiga.
an itch,
Ela nos
but
avisa. Preste atenção.
this feeling
O alerta pode surgir
will
junto
can
com
be
você.
a friend.
Esses são
An
os
alert can
gastos
come together with the news on TV. These are tributary expenses, a way to reduce or suspend taxes for people or companies. Like in a flea circus, what is revealed and what is hidden behind this movement? What is it? Well, in theory, it's a way to incentivize the economy and promote welfare and create more jobs. But does this actually happen? I only believe it if I see it. Every year, Brazil does not collect 250 billion with tributary expenditures, over twice the budget for health. Only in 2017, the pharmaceutical companies got 9.7 billion in tributary benefits, but the cost of medicine keep on increasing. We know who we don't know exactly who are the beneficiaries and what the values they receive. Without transparency, how can we actually demand our improvements? Incentives can't become privileges. Sign our manifesto so that we can have more transparency. All right. I think that worked, right?
Não podemos deixar nada
Great.
pra trás.
Let's not leave anything behind. Great.
Obrigada.
Thank you.
Olha, abraço.
Muito obrigado também, Elis.
Thank you, Ellis.
Facilitou, né, a equipe.
I think that helped our team.
Todo o conteúdo trazido fosse compartilhado. E aí eu tomo a sua
And now, I'd like to just highlight a few of the points.
No início já dessa
First, of this historical retrospective, I think it's important for us to know where we come from, to know where we're going. So,
retrospecto histórico,
these kind of historical looks make it very clear that we need to go through a
pode ser apenas
cultural transformation that is very deep. Not only an adjustment of norms and rules. What I miss oftentimes in this theme of educational campaigns that are really efficient, that allow citizens to not only understand the topics, but also understanding how they can access these improvements that we're talking about just now.
ação coletiva, mas existem alguns players, né,
But there are certain players
que têm papel destacado
in these
legal,
in these institutions
que dá
that need to have a larger contribution,
pela
and civil society needs to organize these people to demand these actors to have a better participation.
debate. E para chamar o nosso próximo
And now our next speaker, I'd first like to do a short parenthesis.
eu particularmente
Me personally,
vai se falar, por exemplo,
when we're going to talk about COVID, we're talking about lost lives, and sometimes the number brings a certain cold, non-feeling factor that takes away the personhood of the people who died.
números para
So we need to go the other way around. We can use numbers to actually expose the personality of my next speaker. This person has a very rich career in academia. Even though he is a tenured professor in the University of São Paulo, he's also had a link with many other universities, and he had 30 books that he published, 167 chapters published in books, over 350 texts in newspapers or magazines. He participated in 86 evaluations of masters and PhDs. He has 46 prizes and awards and has over 100 articles published. So with all of this theoretical contribution that he has and also professional contribution, and so I can only talk about his academic knowledge because of course he also has clients, but then we have client, lawyer, client lawyer privileges. And I also identified that one of your works has a theme that is very dear to me, which is the promotion of people with disabilities. Here in the tribunal, we have a policy towards this effect, and you're talking about fiscal benefits to people with disabilities in Brazil that was published, and I really like that theme, and I'd like to greet you with highlighting the importance of your work. And without further ado and further numbers, I'd like to pass the floor to Mr. Fernando Scaff.
Bom dia a todos. Quero agradecer o convite formulado pelo Tribunal de Contas.
I would like to thank for the invitation from TCU, the Federal Court of Accounts, and I'd like to thank you in the name of Luciana Pereira. She contacted me, she participated in the opening, and she is someone who is really dedicated, very attentive to all the matters regarding the Court of Accounts. I'd like to greet you all in the person of Sérgio Ricardo Caribé, who was such a nice person, and it is really true. But we sometimes talk too much. I tend to talk too much, so please control my time. I think each of us has 15 minutes or something, so I will pay attention to the time. I will speak only 15 minutes as we agreed. And a big hug to my dear friend Felipe. He has done a great work with the independent institutions, and he deserves our greetings. So just to start, dear friends, let's go part by part. First, the Constitutional Charter is celebrating 33 years of inauguration. The Constitution that searches for isonomy, transparency, liberty, the guarantee of social rights, fundamental rights. It is something that deserves to be highlighted. Second, when we talk about social rights, we need to talk about the financing of the rights. We need to have money to do that. That's why the financial tributary law is very important. And the topic that we have today, the transparency, is very important as well. I'd like to highlight some points in these minutes that I have to speak. The first point is transparency is different from publicity. They are different concepts. Publicity is equivalent to a loudspeaker. It's like somebody is on the street and this guy is speaking on a loudspeaker, "Come into my shop, it's such a great shop." So this is the announcement of things. Another thing is transparency. Transparency is as if we were going past the same shop and we look at the window and we could see inside the shop. That is transparency. Nobody made anything public, but they made it transparent. So it's important not to confuse these two concepts, and it has to be present in all control activities. It is an assumption of transparency. Transparency and publicity, they are both under the control, the idea of control, and they are principles of democracy. They are prior to democracy, because without transparency, without publicity, we don't have effectively democracy. All right? And they are institutes of another important concept that sometimes we lose sight of, which is the concept of republic. If democracy is an electoral concept, republic is a concept of respecting the others, respecting the public assets, and the treatment with the public money. The democratic logic can dilute the transparency and publicity, as we have seen in different countries. This guy is democratically elected, and democratically he demolishes the democracy. We have many examples, but I will not go very deep on this topic because we don't have a lot of time. So, Caribe, continuing what we were saying. So the democracy is important, is necessary, but it is not enough. We need republic. We need to think of the public assets, and Felipe points out the importance of these facts. They are a bit cloudy. But talking about the control of the public sector, it can be a social control and a public control. Well, regarding the public control, we are in the house of the public control, the Federal Court of Accounts, the Prosecutor's Office. They are part of this control system. Of course, there are other institutions. The judiciary branch is part of the control system. The Supreme Court is also part of this control system. So we have a very large, a very broad control system. I'm talking about the public control. But as we mentioned earlier, Orlando mentioned it, let's highlight the social control. What is the reasoning of the social control? This reasoning is fundamentally not in the lost article of the Constitution that reads that everyone can just knock the doors of the court to request for something. No, it is little. It is the right of requesting. It does not have to do with social control. Social control goes through another field of liberty, the other fields of freedom, the freedom of press, the freedom of expression. If we understand that, we understand that the press is key for the social control, freedom of speech, freedom of press, and the press sheds light. It brings transparency and publicity. And well, since we are celebrating 33 years of the Constitutional Charter, let's look at an article of the Constitution. Only this one. It's the 5th article. Everyone knows about this article. If you don't know about it, hey, come on, wake up and take a look at that. I will talk about one line of this article, which is the 33rd. It reads, everyone has the right to receive from public institutions information of their private or collective interest that will be provided in the deadlines of the law. So it is consecrated here a very large transparency, the possibility to use the laws of access to information and others. However, let's go to this after the comma. The comma that reads after this section. Except for the situation in which the secret is important for the state. So only these ones are the ones. The secret that is important for the security of society and the state. So it's cumulative. The society and the state. This is the only exception. So why am I doing all this round to reach this point, to celebrate our Constitution and show the rights for the people? Because when we establish 100 years of secret of the credit card of the family of the president, it is wrong. It is not security of the state. And here it was revealed by the social control and by the press. Second, to establish 100 years of secret to the access of the information of the sons of the president, how many times they went to the presidential palace in the past 2-3 years. It is not control, it is not secrecy to the of the state to the society. However, it was reviewed by the social control. But the whole point of the repertoire amendments, the so-called PR9, I think. If it's not, please correct me. PR9? EP9. Well, these amendments, they were all also reviewed by the press. There was a reporter called Breno from Estadão. He's the leader of a team that is discussing that and investigating. It is also social control. If all of this is true, and I think it is important, I think it is true, of course, we need to check the sources, check if it's really relevant. You cannot just believe in the press, you need to check the data. But if it is really true, something has to be done. Something has to be done about these rapporteur amendments. And I will disagree with the previous speaker that talked about the electoral process that is similar to the credibility of Norway. Well, it can be, I believe, your research, but wait a minute. The rapporteur amendment, they are a distortion for our electoral process because you pay for the electoral group with public money, and it is wrong. The perception here is whatever it is, but we need to check this data because despite of our improvements, and I agree with Orlando in that point, in the past 33 years, if we compare to the past, but we are still bad in terms of budget. Let's stop closing our eyes on that. These amendments of the rapporteur indicate that, of course, we advanced a lot. I agree with Orlando. I agree with Felipe. If we look at the whole 33 years in this trajectory, but we need to improve much more. This position that the rapporteur amendments will favor the maintenance of the status quo, enabling the financing of electoral groups through public money. It is simply wrong. And the public control, okay, I'm not talking about the social control now, the public control of these mechanisms has been very weak. So the TCU has worked a lot on that, has shed light on these things, but they need to take action to avoid a bigger evil, which is the finished and concrete fact. The same thing happens with the the Supreme Court. They are about to appreciate this matter. So if we cross our arms and wait, like the train that is about to come, it's about to come, as Chico Buarque mentions, we will not go anywhere. Certain measures have to be taken right now, immediately. So today, let's have our two eyes wide open to see what's happening and check that the electoral process is being distorted by the electoral financing. And it is not transparent. It is a serious problem. And even knowing that the Court of Accounts is watching and the press is watching, and we know that the Supreme knows that, but something has to be done. And I'm using this channel to say this. Something has to be done to change the situation. Otherwise, we will, on one side, to use the secrecy for things that are not in favor of society and the state, and it will distort the constitution that we are celebrating the 33 years today. On the other hand, we will see the maintenance of the power in the use of public money to buy electoral groups, which is wrong. So, in a nutshell, and in 12 minutes, I know I still have 3 minutes. I'm counting. I don't want to cause any problems to the organization, but we need to pay attention in the public control, in the social control, shed more light to face these problems, shed spotlights on these problems. Do not confuse publicity and transparency. They are two different things. If you expect somebody to understand what is written in the official diary, even for the technicians who are in this room, when you read it again and again, and you cannot understand clearly what is written there. So you need to mature and exchange ideas to understand. So we don't expect the population to understand this whole mechanism. It is something of a trajectory of 30, 40, or 50 years ahead with dedication of all of us now. So if we're going to do that, I'm a partner to help you with this. But also, we need to do something with the other instances to combat the abuses that are being done. So to highlight all these issues of the difference between publicity and transparency, the difference between democracy and republic, and the abuses that we are witnessing in the light of the 5th article, line 33, that deals about secrecy only in the situation that can be threatening for the state or the society. I finished my talk just collecting what is being doing and what can be done. So I finish my participation with the credit of about 2 minutes, with the collaboration, asking for the collaboration of all of us to tackle what is happening today. So I repeat my gratitude to be here with all of you. Thank you, Professor Eustáquio. Your remarks are very lucid, very timely. You have a very you have a knowledge of these topics. So, and we have to face the problems. We cannot close our eyes or oversee these things or try to solve complex problems with easy solutions. The problems have to be tackled as they are. I didn't make any reference until now because I was waiting for the expositions of the guests. So, to mention the 33rd anniversary of the Constitution. 33 is a very important number to me. It was important in my life in different situations. I will not tell you because I don't want to spend time. It is the age of Jesus Christ. So it is an important number to my life. It's the age of Jesus Christ, and it can bring some more empathy to us. Without empathy, we cannot have discussions, and without discussions, we will not have a budget that is real, that is feasible, and that will not be an object of different opinions or political managements that will determine certain expenses in detriment to others. So all the remarks of our guests are really relevant, and I would like to highlight all these aspects. I would like to propose to our guests, as we receive the questions, that we could start another round so that they could add more remarks, considering the participation of all the guests. I'm still waiting for the results of the survey, and I'm going to ask our team and our technical team to check on that. And instead of asking questions, I think it's interesting for now to use about 2-3 minutes for each of you, just to provide more information to enrich your position, and then we will wait for the questions that are coming from the chat. And I think it's a good idea to have these dynamics, and I'm going to ask the technical team to show the results of the survey so we can even guide this next round of remarks. Let's see if we can see what we have here. So the main word is planning. In Brazil, we have the bad habit to think of the topics of medium and long term in a way that they are only mid and long term, but we also need to think of these problems as something that have to be dealt with now, and then think of the mid and long term. So as I mentioned on the pluriannual plan and the work of our previous speaker, questioning about this time window between the pluriannual plans, if it's reasonable or not. So other words are here: transparency and the reminder that we should not confuse transparency with publicity, and other important words that will strengthen our democracy, not only in the electoral moment, but during all times. So with these brief words, there is another slide with more information from the survey. Could you please show it to us? There you are. I cannot see it very clearly, but we can move it, scroll it down, so we can see all the words. We have the index of corruption is commented here. All these topics, all these remarks come from our virtual public to guide the debate. I think that this point of translating the budget in an easier language to guarantee that the budget will be really executed and assuring the execution of social rights. All these topics, they are interacting, they're related to each other. We have one more screen to show you. So, since we have no questions, let's change our dynamics. I'm going to invite some of our guests to make some comments on these questions. The first question is, wouldn't it be the moment to use the social control aligned with transparency of public accounts, allowing society to give opinions, to define and monitor the results of the public budget? So I'm going to ask Felipe Salto and Carmela after him. And the other questions we're going to ask the other guests to answer.
I'd like to congratulate everyone for their excellent presentations. There was a point that Fernando Scaffi brought about, that was these parliamentary amendments and their relation to the budget. So the initiative for the executive are from the priorities of the budget come from the executive, and they're limited but to 1.2% of liquid revenue, of net revenue. And in relation to the question that was asked here, I understand social control is fundamental, but we must be clear that the representatives of the democracy are elected exactly to deal with the budget in relation to social interests. So I have a concern with assemblyism. I like the idea of participative budget. I think there's some interesting experiences all over Brazil, but we must be careful because people have little time to dedicate to the technical aspects, the set of information, analyzing everything in order to effectively participate in this area. Of course, publicity and transparency are two fundamental premises, like Professor Scaffi mentioned. However, we must really look at the social control instruments. Participatory budget might be the most famous one, and it has this problem because those people who have a daily job, 8 hours or more on the job, they're going to have a hard time to dedicate themselves to this and demand this from society, because society elects its representatives to take care of their interests, as presented in the Constitution and the laws, and the rule and the duty of politicians and technicians that is to follow what is set out in the Constitution and laws. Thank you for your comments, and now I'd like to invite Carmela for her considerations and with this question that was set forth by the public. Well, I tend to disagree from our colleagues that spoke before me, because we're working with data and not common sense and research. Professor Leonardo Abitza did a research on participation, and he brought numerical data of how people participated in municipal conferences, state conferences, and national conferences that started in the Fernando Henrique government, and they still existed until very recently. Well, they still exist, but are residual, and the numbers are impressive. The amount of people is impressive. I'm trying to open up this article here so I can show you. This is an article from me and José Antonio Moroni in a book that we are going to launch from IPEA, and we're going to bring this data forth. I'm talking about 2,000 people in one national conference coming from a process in which over 6,000 people participated. So people do have a desire to participate in, and they have very different profiles, but most of them are women. Most of them are advisors, because those people who are involved in the councils and the municipalities, they know more about public policies, and then they want to contribute. So I believe that actually, even without time, people do have this desire to participate. I think that we need to have education so people can participate. So we won't have the participation of 200 million Brazilians. We won't. But we could have the participation of 100,000. That's possible. And that makes a very big difference. So there's another issue here that when speaking in a national level, because the municipal level experiences are very interesting. Russia is doing participatory budgets. This is replicated all over the world. There was a meeting in Cascais, Portugal, 2 years ago that gathered countries that were in the low in the index of the IBP, and lots of them were replicating our experience and doing these participatory budgets. And there was an attempt to bring this to an instance called the Intercouncil Forum, because there was already an identification that the people who participated in the conferences, but the public budget wasn't discussed there. So we left these processes of participation that had to do with, we designed policies that were very interesting, very complex, very systemic policies, but when it got to this issue of the budget, then things didn't go forward. So they just talked to the pluriannual plan. And they already talked about before this how hard it is to get the budget, the pluriannual plan, and participation to all work together. But these councils have been extinguished as well by the government. So this would be another further step, because these processes are cumulative. Participation is not fast. It doesn't meet this time of bureaucracy. So we need to be creative. And I think in moments of crises, they're really appropriate for us to think outside the box and bring more ideas to give us ideas. There's a very interesting event as well, which is people have never been invited to participate on development public policies, only social policies. And so, if you look at the territories which are impacted by mega energy projects, these people are barely consulted, and they don't believe in this development model, this extractivist developmentalist model. And so there's a series of issues that I don't have the time here today, but this is an important reflection for us to go in depth into a second round of debates. Thank you. Thank you, Carmela, for your considerations. In fact, we can't go too much in depth, and even in this sense, I'd like to remind you all who are watching us on YouTube, those of you who want can ask questions on YouTube. Sometimes we won't be able to answer them, as well as the considerations that you might make. All of these will be addressed to the technical units in the TCU so that they can consider these suggestions and questions in their planning, in their actions. Okay, so I'd like to congratulate you, and it's very important to have this debate with each person has a few readings. So Felipe agreed with the consideration with Carmela, and really this participation is a very fertile ground for maturing ideas. Next up. Okay, how to reinforce the transparency instruments in decentralized policies so that we can know the application of resources at the end point. How to see how the municipality spent federal money. This has a lot to do with what Carmela talked about recently, but now I'm going to ask Orlando to answer this question, and he has this point of view from the Budget Committee in the Federal Senate, and he can also mention how, in this federative design, how can we allow for the execution of the federal budget by other subnational entities to happen in a more transparent manner, in this perception of transparency as something that can be appropriated by society. And I'd also like to make a comment that we watch with a certain concern this extinction of councils. So the Council for the People with Disability was extinguished, and now they re-edited the decree, but they took away the seat from the representatives of municipal and state councils. And to me, this breaks a very important channel of communication to bring the demands of the people who are at the end point of our policies. So, Orlando, can you comment on this question? Well, how much time do I have? If you could speak in around 2 to 3 minutes so that we can go further. Well, it's hard to talk about this topic in 3 minutes, but I'm going to try to be very brief. Well, first and foremost, I'm going to talk about RP9s because they have a relationship with how much is going to the municipality. So first and foremost, I have an article published on this topic in the magazine Poder 360. It is called Rapporteur's Amendments. We are all responsible for them. Actually, RP9s are basically a shot that went wrong. The spell turned against the wizard. So basically, I have a personal opinion that the rapporteur's amendments existed for a long time, ever since the early 2000s. In 2006 it started. And before the rapporteur's amendments, the political negotiation existed between the legislative and executive. This happened in the 90s, and this was widely reported by the press that you would give amendments two legislators before important votes. This happened in the Fernando Henrique government still. Then we had the compulsory amendments, and then finally the rapporteur's amendments, and now RP9s. But unlike what people think, RP9s brought more transparency in comparison to the rapporteur's amendments, because they existed and no one was able to see it. Now we can monitor the execution of this amendment, even in municipalities. Yesterday I made a consultation and I saw which municipalities received these resources. So actually, we do actually need to have social control and the control of institutions like, well, institutions that are concerned about this. Let's say democracy isn't going to be done from one minute to the next, and it's important for people to realize and not elect more parliamentarians and presidents that are doing the wrong thing. So what happened with the parliamentary amendments? We had a very expressive increase over the past few years, and I would dare to say that when, well, the rapporteur's amendments, they're not from a rapporteur, they're from a political group that is actually carrying out these budget amendments, and the rapporteurs are an instrument to do this. But when we are saying that we have 126 requests of impeachment in the president of the Chamber of Deputies House, well, we see that the Congress is stronger. So the amendments went from 7 billion to 30 billions over the past few years. And who is going to change that? Well, votes. I think only by voting. So, about the possibility of tracing these resources. Well, yes, we can trace these resources on the RP9. We can't actually, only the article on the Estadão could mention this, about how this about how these payments are being are being given to different parliamentarians. So something else that I would like to talk about is about the initiative of the budget comes from the executive. Well, in the United States, the budget comes from the executive, and when they get to the parliament, they can rip it apart. The problem is the quality of our amendments. We should be discussing the quality of them. We should be discussing public policies in these amendments. We should be discussing and having society pressuring parliamentarians so that this could happen. But unfortunately, I think we're very far from this. I don't think just changing the type of budget is not going to enhance this unless we have civil participation. I agree about this democratic issue that, as Fernando Scaff said, it's not just the parliamentary amendments. We also have the party's fund. It increased quite a bit, so we must be able to control this. Civil society must be able to control these values. I'm talking as a citizen, not as a public employee, and that's what I'm talking about. Is there a way, I'm going back to the question, is there a way to get to the very end point? Yes, there are. Is it hard? Yes, it's very hard. Do we have the possibility? Yes, we do. Do we know which parliamentarian actually made this investment? No, we don't. Unfortunately not. But I think I probably spoke over my time. I apologize, but I'm really passionate about this topic. I could talk hours and hours about this, but thank you so much for the opportunity. And that's that. Thank you, Orlando. Yes, I mean, we want to be here speaking for a long time, passing more information. So I'd like to thank you for your answers, and I'd like the technical support to give us the next question, please. This is the question for Felipe Salto. For Felipe Salto, can you better explain the functioning of instruments that you mentioned in your presentation? With the PPA, is the PPA, the pluriannual plan, no longer necessary? Okay. I think all of us are still hungry. I love these debates. These are great. What Carmela and Orlando said. I think dialogue is the way for us to be able to change things. Well, the pluriannual plan is an anodyne instrument. It uses HR, it uses financial resources to produce a huge amount of information that are useless. I'm going to use that strong word. It's useless. They guarantee a few things, like the execution of certain public policies, certain social policies. They guarantee that they will continue. But as a planning instrument for infrastructure for the next 20 years, or the guidelines that we're going to put in the environmental sector, how we're going to finance human rights, social policies, all of this is very distant from this PPA model that we have currently. We need to bring in the logic of planning inside the budget and use the annual budget law for this, like a medium-term expenditure framework. We need to project the revenues in a technical way based on a precise macroeconomic model. This macroeconomic model will create certain premises for GDP, for interest rates, inflation, and this will help create a revenue estimate that's actually accurate. Thank you for your agility and clarity. Let me just add one thing, Canindé. I apologize. I need to leave in 10 minutes, Caribe, so if you have any questions, I will be, I do need to leave in 10 minutes, so if you have any questions for me. No, I was thinking in that very sense. Okay, let's look into the next question then. So this is a very appropriate question, a very timely question. How is, with today's budget structure, is it possible to apply the 14th paragraph of Article 165 of the Federal Constitution that allows for the provision of pluriannual investments in the annual budget law? Does it allow it? Yes. I would say that the investment is zero because these foresights, you can say, oh, we're not going to invest anything. But the spending limit law put investments inside this spending limit, and now investments are lowering throughout time. You can look at the last 4 or 5 years, because other compulsory expenses are advancing on the investments. So, is it possible to have pluriannual investments? Yes. You can even say investments are going to be zero. However, preserving investments, that's not the question. That's not going to be possible. It's not going to be possible to preserve investments, because to preserve investments, you must take away investments from the spending limit. There's no other way. On the way that it is, everyone's stuck together. Everyone is elbowing each other to try and get some space. Well, the investments are losing in this battle. I don't know if I was clear and objective enough. Very clear, very objective. And now, when I'm going to invite everyone for the final considerations, I will invite you first, okay? So, next question. Wouldn't it be the moment to create more rigid legislation to punish deviations of resources from the budget? Because the current ones apparently don't work. Is there a problem in the legislation?
No, I believe that the example that we had in the budget guidelines law, there's an article that is about using credit for negotiations in the Congress. The law exists, in my understanding, as I mentioned in the presentation. It has to do with enforcement. Enforcement comes in the scope of governance, in the perspective of transparency and the participation and accountability. We have vertical accountability, horizontal accountability, and others. There are many elements. I think that the main focus to demand the control is the accountability. And many of us know very clearly where the problems are. The point is how to solve the problems, and it was mentioned here. There are different levels of transparency, and we know, of course, we need to improve. But then, what is the consequence of this? And that's the point. The trend in the world is to keep it less strict in the bureaucratic point of view, and increase the enforcement and the effectiveness of decisions. I would like to take the chance to make two remarks. First, I want to make it clear that in my understanding, and it was we made this focus here, and Orlando mentioned that in my understanding, the EP9 is a problem. The rapporteur amendment. I think it's a problem, but it is not the only problem. We cannot limit the amendment RP9. It was mentioned that the existence of the amendment itself in Brazil, as it is done in Brazil, since the beginning, it is extremely complicated to put the name of a congressperson in the public budget. For private issues, for private things, like stamping the money for that specific person, is really problematic. Now, talking about the theoretical and literary premises, it is a way to protect the budget from the absolutist matter, from the king. The legislative branch has a different vision of that. So, to limit the RP9, the rapporteur amendment, it comes from a problem that already exists. The very existence of the amendments today hurt constitutional matters. So it is a reprogramming of income and expenses, and we don't have money for all that. And there are other problems that are not the amendment, only the amendments. For example, the partisan fund and other problems. Another point that I'd like to say that, I'm sorry, Professor Scaff, but when we work with quantitative research, I don't know if it's your focus, we have this premise, that terrible premise, that people know the metrics of the indexes and indicators. When I made reference to the democratic index and then I did the distinction, I didn't have an explanatory caption for each element. And as my orientation told me, you don't fight against the data. You can question the metrics, but not the data. And if it's part of your research work, okay. But in your theoretical defense, when we have the metrics of the legislative process, in the case of the index of democracy, it has to do with the elections, the state elections. You see the presence of opposition and other democratic elements that, as it was mentioned by you, they are present in the metrics of the other three elements that are missing in Brazil. When we sum them up, the democracy indicator in Brazil is a little higher than 6. Between 6 and 8, it is defined as a failing democracy, which is different from Norway, which is a full democracy. But it is ultimately a matter of metrics. So we don't have a lot of time to explain a lot about the metrics, but we know that the elements that are missing and that they can bring biases to the electoral problems, they are included in the metrics of lower values. In the general index of democracy, it is taking Brazil to a situation of a failing democracy, including the element that was mentioned by Orlando. The United States is also a failing democracy using these parameters. And one more reference regarding investments. In the technical point of view, in academic point of view, if there is no change in parameters in the budgetary institutions, we will not be able to implement the investments. Because if we don't have a pluriannual budget perspective, looking at the budget in the medium and long term, the data will be in a very short-sight perspective. So we need to elevate this discussion of planning. We have been doing that for over a year, discussing with other planning instruments for medium and long term. So this is what I have to say, and I'll be here for any other comments. Thank you, Welles, for your answer, for your comments. I took the word to say that, well, there are other questions, but due to the lack of time, I'm going to ask the technical support to forward these questions to our participants, our guests, and then they can answer the question directly to the person who asked. But I have to finish the moment of questions now, and I will go to the moment of concluding remarks of all the participants. I'm going to ask you all to be very, very brief. Well, since you hand the floor to me, I'm going to be very brief. I would like to thank you all. I would like to thank Luciene that contacted me. Caribe, you are the best. So Felipe, Orlando, all of you, thank you so much. Everyone with no exception. Just a little comment. As someone from the academia, we need to check and recheck the data, the numbers, and the information. That's why the social control through the press is important, but not determinant. And the social control through instruments and the public control through institutions such as the Federal Court of Accounts is also important, but we need to check the information. The amendments are a problem, but there is also the problem of transparency, which is the focus of our meeting. That's why I talked about the focus of our meeting. So once again, I thank you all, and I apologize because I really have to go now. And it's a shame, but I have to leave before the ending of the session. But before you leave, let me please thank you, Professor Fernando, for your participation. It was very enlightening, and it really helped our debate. So, on my behalf, I would like to thank you very much for being with us. Thank you for your presence here with us. Thank you very much. See you. Now, for the final remarks, Ms. Carmélia Zigoni. I just would like to thank you for the invitation. I would like to thank Luciene and Sergio. It was a great debate. I was the only woman on this virtual table, so I'm glad to represent the women. It's always good to have black specialists and female specialists in these spaces. I'd like to congratulate the Federal Court of Accounts for this week of debates. I think we should have more moments of discussion such as this one, and we need to build the improvements together. So thank you very much for inviting me. Orlando, please. I'd like to ask you to tell us your final remarks. I would like to thank TCU for the invitation, and I'd like to thank for the learning that I received from the other participants in this roundtable. I hope I contributed to the debate. I think 2 hours is not enough for finishing this debate. It is a very necessary aspect. It is really indispensable for the country. I generally say that the transparency in the public budget is as important as the 5th article, I mean, the chapter of fundamental rights of the Constitution, because without transparency there are no fundamental rights and public policies. So I think it's part of the maturing of the society, the path of understanding the public budget and demand it from the politicians. So I'm talking about everyone who is doing this job, the press, the NGOs, and the citizens in general. But we really need to practice our democratic power in the vote and interfere in the country so we can follow the good path. So that's why we need to have information about the budget, and the budget is an instrument of transparency. There are many failures, many problems, but the information that we have access to can show us what is wrong and what needs to be changed. And to me, this is how we need to use the budget as a path to enable criticism that can provide social change in this country. Thank you so much to all of you. Thank you, Orlando. Now, Ellis, I would like to thank the Federal Court of Accounts in the name of my friend Caribe. It was a wonderful debate. I congratulate my colleagues, and I'd like to leave a message that it's really great to participate in an event with different people from different places, and there is a unanimity that we are all favor to transparency, because it is obvious, it is extremely important, and I hope that this panel will be an instrument for the moderators, for the other colleagues that are watching us. Together we can cooperate in favor to improvements to issues regarding transparency. And I say that because we cannot limit this debate to transparency alone, but also include participation, accountability, democracy, and the effects of it, the decrease of corruption, etc. So this is the message I would like to convey to you. It's just the beginning, all right? Thank you so much. Thank you, Alice. And just to finish, I now have the honor to close the comments of the guests. Thank you so much for all the participants of this roundtable. It's a pleasure to participate here with you, to get to know you, even if it's virtually. Some of them I already know in person, but this debate showed that we can disagree in some points, but there is a consensus that we need to improve the transparency of public budget, to use the instrument that we already have, and to attempt for reforms and measures to enhance this transparency, the accountability of the public accounts. It is really key. I just would like to thank the Federal Court of Accounts in the name of Luciane. She has been very gentle, and she has organized very elevated events in terms of relevance. And thank you for the General Secretary who invited me. Well, I would like to thank you all for your presence. Professor Fernando, who needed to leave, but also Felipe, Vélez, not only myself, but also Luciane in the team that is taking all the measures for this event to take place. And I'd like to inform our audience that we still have about 400 people watching our debate. So to all of you, we thank you very much. And I hope that this debate added value and knowledge to you, added understanding for the topics that were mentioned here, and the need to understand this topic. I think this panel will reach a simple way to understand this topic. So I would like to thank our guests, and I'd like to invite all of you who are watching us that TCU is promoting the whole week talking about the budget. So tomorrow we're going to have the third panel, and it has to do with all the topics discussed here, and the topic is the parliamentary amendments and the impact in the public budget. So if you found this discussion was important on the amendments, we will deepen this conversation in panel 3. Actually, today we have a panel, so tomorrow morning we will have this other panel. So you are all invited to participate, and I thank you all for participating. Everyone in the audience, and my greetings and my salute to the organization of the event. And I hope we met the expectation of our guests. So thank you very much for your participation. It was an honor to receive you here, and we hope that the audience will be present in the other panels of this week, the first budget week of the Federal Court of Accounts. Thank you so much.